6 months of waiting is finally over. Yes, it's Christmas in July, but a different kind than the one you usually look forward to. It's AI Action Day. Or, depending on who you ask, you could say that this is the first meeting of the AI Reading Book Club. And today's read is the AI Action Plan. You can see everyone has their own edited copy. It's going to be a fantastic Scaling Laws episode. Thanks for listening in. Folks, we have so much to get to, but I just want the quick and easy takeaways. So, Neil, at a high level, if you were to send out one tweet gut reaction to the AI Action Plan, it would be?
It'd be the AI Action Plan continues the pivot of this administration away from a overly cautious, risk-fearing approach of the previous administration and really emphasizes that AI is a giant opportunity that the United States needs to seize.
So we've got to pivot. I do think you maybe breached the 140 character limit, but I'll let listeners figure that out. Janet.
I'll back that in. I think AI is a big deal, and this shows this. It's got actions for cross-government agencies. I'm really interested in the focus on adoption. It's moving away from the only focusing on frontier models to actually looking at how can we diffuse across government, society, and education and workforce.
Very exciting. Neil? Oh, I already went to Neil. Tim.
Neil again.
I was just so excited. Neil's take.
I'm dominating.
He's dominating. AI dominance has been achieved, yeah.
The vibes are great. One thing I like about it is it focuses on, I think, maybe the most underrated thing about AI policy, which is that it's like really hard to know what's going to happen over the next few years. So focusing in on improving the government's ability to kind of measure and evaluate progress, and especially domestic versus foreign models is a big deal here. And then I think focuses in on the things that we do know are problems and sort of we should be trying to solve, which is, AI and energy is a really big deal, and we need to unbottleneck that. And then also that we need to reform science to sort of take advantage of like the affordances that AI provides. Excited to chat about all this.
And good vibes. Yes, Jessica.
I'd agree. There's a lot to like here. I mean, good stuff on cybersecurity for critical infrastructure, on building, capacity for AI incident response, investments in biosecurity, all kinds of good stuff. The woke AI stuff is, I think, predictable and silly and unhelpful, but broadly, I think there's a lot here to build on.
Well, speaking of building, we have a lot to construct here. So there are 3 pillars, 3 principles, and 30 different sections. And that's too much to cover in one Scaling Laws podcast. Unfortunately, I would prefer to spend this whole AI book club with you all until the end of the night. But we have other obligations, apparently. So I want to start off, though, with this AI innovation pillar, which is probably the longest section or has the most recommendations. And Neil, you've dove into this extensively. Are there a couple provisions or sections that stand out most to you, or how do you think this perpetuates the pivot you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, so there is a lot here, and it actually lumps. This might be the least well-defined category. There's some stuff in here that doesn't. There's just a lot of different things in here, but I'll pick out a couple that I think characterize the overall tone, and those start up very early. And so there's a real emphasis at the very beginning about like removing red tape and regulation, and seeing that as a primary risk to the U.S. Maintaining and achieving global AI dominance. And so this is a focus not just on the federal level, and there's some recommendations about how federal agencies should examine how they can remove barriers to innovation in this space through their regulatory reform. But also there's a discussion of states and the potential challenges that a wave of state regulation might present to continued U.S. innovation. So that's one big component that I picked out of this.
And just to hang there for a second, because the language here is suggesting that federal funding for some projects will be contingent upon the extent to which a state has AI regulations that are deemed burdensome. I can just hear the Twitter howls right now of, oh my gosh, how are we going to figure this out, and what does that mean? And I do think this is probably going to be one of the most contentious and controversial provisions, and we get it right at the start of just saying, hey, here we go.
It's right up front, and I think apparently Trump just mentioned it in his speech that he's giving, he's probably still giving right now. And so, that recommendation borrows some language from actually the Senate version of the moratorium, the pause. And so I think that shows some desire of this administration to deal with it. However, the recommendation area is pretty soft. There's a lot of squishiness in it, and so I think people who are howling about this should spend some time looking at the language, because I don't find it strong enough for my taste. I prefer it was stronger. So maybe that gives some comfort to people who are on the other side.
They can go howl at the moon or something else. Yeah. So Tim, I wanted to come to you specifically on this section as well about the focus on science in the innovation bucket. And as Neil pointed out, maybe doesn't necessarily fit squarely in how folks were maybe previously defining innovation, but what excites you about this, or what's some of the big takeaways about these science provisions?
Yeah, so I think directionally there's a couple of things, and I think the big thing to kind of know here is that, the way that, first that, AI could obviously just massively accelerate scientific progress, especially in fields that are particularly amenable to it. So I think anything related to code, math, and biology in the near term especially fits the bill here. But I think we also need to recognize that the way science is traditionally funded and structured by the federal government isn't that well suited to how AI research should be funded, especially like AI-driven scientific research as well. And so, if you think about like the classic way that science is funded, it's, you have like a PI at a university, and so they hire a few students, and you have like 20% overhead, and most scientists who in this situation spend half their time applying for grants and half the time actually doing the research work. It takes sort of on average like 10 months to sort of get access to funding after you apply. And if you think about sort of fast-paced fields and take advantage of AI and the automation that provides, as well as sort of the needs for centralized compute and engineering and infrastructure, that kind of grant structure really doesn't work. And so what's really cool to see in the action plan is calling out focused research organizations as sort of like a new model. So basically have a big institution, you kind of give them a block grant. So they hire the engineering team, sort of like build up the compute, have that sort of centralized support, and basically let scientists run wild with, delivering AI discoveries sort of in areas like biology and material science. So that's really cool to see, and we've already seen success with sort of outside of publicly funded research with the ARC Institute, who you might have seen has been super successful with this focused research organization model. They put out this EVO model, which is sort of like a foundation model for biology that's been incredibly successful. So I think especially is like very, very nice to see in this. But I think the big meta thing with this is this is a very long list of recommendations, some of them more tentative than others, and I'm really interested to see which of these things, hopefully all of them, find their way into executive orders and how actually targeted and concrete they are. Like, do they give mandatory action with a deadline to an agency? Because if they don't, very unlikely that the specific things will happen.
Yeah, and I omitted my own high-level summary. I'm sorry for breaking my own rules, but it was going to be, now it's execution, right? It's very easy to put a bunch of things on a piece of paper and then just say good vibes, as we did earlier. It's another thing to get the executive order going, get the agencies actually acting on it. I mean, the number of action items now for a number of these agencies who are already thinking, "Hoo boy, I don't have enough staff," or perhaps staff have been leaving, or whatever's been happening. There's a lot of capacity questions now that I think are going to be raised by this. But to your point also, Tim, I feel like this is kind of like Christmas morning when you go down the stairs, you're super excited, and you see like the outline of a bike, and you think, oh, that's going to be my bike, but when do I actually get it? When's it going to be assembled? Who's going to build it? And so it's been funny seeing the reactions on social media so far, where everyone has their own thread, and they're all like, here are my top 10 provisions. And we see, if you're an abundance person, you're super excited about the scientific provisions. This could have been lifted from Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein's entire chapter on scientific discovery, right? And then at the same time, folks across the spectrum really welcoming this. So within this bucket, is there anything else that stands out to you, Neil, that you really wanted to drill in on?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I found particularly gratifying was there's very early emphasis as a section 3 that's on open source, right? And talks about the vital nature of open source as a source of competition, but also an input to research and scientific discovery. And I found that very gratifying. That was not a foregone conclusion that open source would have such a strong position in the plans of this administration. And so, as a strong supporter of open source, I found that very gratifying.
Yeah, and I'm eager to hear from Janet and Jessica on this one, because open source has been it's gone through many lives of the worst thing we've ever heard about in AI, of open source means we're instantly going to cede everything to China, or open source means, bad actors are going to be developing bioweapons tomorrow. Janet, what's your read of this kind of transition to a more favorable posture towards open source, and what's behind it? Is this all just DeepSeek and our reaction to it?
Yeah, I think what really stands out to me in this plan is, and the administration has done this really well, is that threading the needle between innovation and risk management. And so if you look across Twitter today, you'll see a lot of folks from the safety camp saying, hey, this is actually pretty good. And then you see the same commentary coming from the abundance and accelerationist camp as well. And I think what's really interesting here is that it's done a good job of grappling with the uncertainty as to what's going to be emerging at the frontier of AI capabilities. So even in the section on open source, it mentions that you have to protect and disseminate and manage that balance. And we see this coming out too with the initiative here around protecting commercial and government AI applications and sensitive IP. So at the moment, it's the private sector that are custodians of this sensitive IP, which is the amalgamation of billions of dollars of investment in research and compute, and these model weights are stealable. And at the moment, we don't really have that channel necessarily from the intelligence community, the threat intelligence, channeled through into the people who are actually taking action on protecting this sensitive IP. And so that's another thing I'm really excited to see, that there's this focus on protecting the US advantage as we look to bolster that lead.
Yeah, and that tees up an interesting expanded version again of innovation that we're seeing in this section, where it's not only innovation in the sort of typical commercial fashion that we would typically discuss innovation in, but also innovation in AI R&D itself and in AI research itself. So Jessica, what stood out to you about that expanded notion and really looking at how can we understand AI better as a sort of key innovation principle?
Yeah, I think there were two things that stood out to me in this section, and one is the sort of support for investments in the science of evaluations, understanding interpretability, control. I do think that these things can help accelerate adoption, because if we understand how a model is going to perform, it sort of enables us to sort of understand and therefore mitigate risks. I think that's super important. The other piece of this was around sort of supporting, companies or firms' efforts to protect themselves from malicious cyber actors and insider threats. I thought that was a really important add. I'm obviously sort of in full-throated support of that principle. There was almost nothing in there, though, about how they were going to achieve that. So I actually thought there was quite a bit more room to talk about how, what kind of information sharing mechanisms would be useful on this issue. And, I think room to consider things like a NIST-led, framework for AI security that might help kind of build a baseline. What about incentives for, secure development? There's kind of a lot more that could be done there. So glad to see it mentioned. Would love to see it fleshed out.
Yeah, and it brings to mind CISA, which CISA doesn't have the best reputation of folks buying into, hey, let's share a bunch of sensitive cybersecurity information and ensure we actually engage in this practice of sharing whatever exploits we're seeing and things like that. So there's a lot of room for improvement.
I think that's also gotten harder recently, but let's hope we can get ourselves on the right track.
Yeah, and I do want to circle back to Janet's point about adoption generally being in this section, and this incorporates your perspective too, Jessica, on when I go and I speak to law groups, they're already such AI skeptics of, oh, well, the second I enter that information, it's just going to regurgitate out the whole paragraph I entered, and there goes all my client information. There's a whole nother can of worms. I don't want to get into the professional rules that's not fun. But if you have that level of explainability and interpretability, then when and if we achieve AGI or superintelligence or whatever you have, that adoption component is going to be so central, which brings up one of the first principles, the leading principle according to the plan, worker readiness and kind of workforce development. And so, Neil, what was your takeaway on the focus here on trying to get more employers and employees themselves up to speed on AI?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a generally it's hard to disagree with this point, right? So it's
I don't want workers to learn anything. Yeah, let them figure it out.
I mean, and I think given that the plan is very focused on this as an opportunity, they want the opportunity to be broad. This isn't just an opportunity for companies who are building products. It's a big opportunity for everybody. And a lot of that worker development is not only training on how to use AI, but some of that worker development is also like the skill sets that we need to actually build all this infrastructure that we need as well. So it's a pretty well thought out idea that basically we need to get people up to speed. Obviously, there's a lot of details to figure out there. I did want to say, you sort of framed the adoption question, which like Janet, I am a huge fan of the fact that there's more of a focus on adoption as a question that we'll have to answer after we get to AGI or ASI. I would say if we stop development right now, there is a huge amount of benefit that could come from adopting these products across the economy. And so I think adoption is a challenge right now. I think the plan recognizes that, and I think that's right.
Yeah, and I would applaud that if it wouldn't mess up the microphone. So I will not do that. And I wanted to kind of wrap up this section quickly on the repetition here of combating synthetic media. And Jessica, you and I, and this whole group, could talk for 4 hours about mis and disinformation and AI. What was your takeaway from this slight mention of the Take It Down Act saying, yes, we liked that, and let's do more of that? Is this another instance of good messaging, let's wait to see it?
Yeah, there's a handful of things here that I think are relevant. One, you saw that it calls for the NIST's risk management framework to remove the word misinformation along with climate change, DEI, et cetera. I think it's a little bit ironic to be purporting to promote and protect free speech by creating a government list of banned words. I think that is sort of unhelpful. And I think, we do actually need to have kind of an honest conversation about what the last 5 years of content moderation debates that I personally think have served nobody, mean for a world of LLMs. Like, what do we expect, these models to say when asked questions about sensitive political topics? So we have to grapple with that. I just don't think this is like an honest grappling with that. On the specific provisions around synthetic media, I thought there was, some interesting stuff here around particular use cases, regarding within the legal system, useful. And I think broadly, like not being drawn into a broader narrative about deepfakes are coming for us all in every context, everywhere, helpful.
Yeah, and it does bring a lot of technical questions to mind. Specifically, I'm jumping to a different section, but I'm trying my best to adhere to the buckets. The provision requiring government procurement of models that show objective truth, I believe, is something akin to the language called for here. Not sure how you train necessarily for objective truth. If anyone here would like to share their insight.
Or who should be the arbiter of objective truth?
It's a tough one.
Yeah, I guess there's kind of two challenges here. One is defining it, and then two is ensuring that the model sticks to whatever your definition is. This comes back to this robustness, interpretability, control question. There's currently we don't have good methods for reliably getting AI models to do what we want, as evidenced by a lot of the things that have recently happened, especially around Grok. And so, I think there's kind of two challenges to deal with here. The first is obviously much more contentious, what should the specific values be and how do you adjudicate that in really specific cases? But also just technically, this is, currently well outside the reach of what the field is able to do.
Mm-hmm. So that it might be sort of hand wavy, right? For the atmospherics, and then we'll see where the rubber hits the road.
Neil?
Given all the reporting on this, I thought that this would be a much bigger focus in the plan, and it really isn't that big of a. Bias only appears twice in the entire plan. One of them is in the sort of preamble, and one of them is in this section. But one thing that I did notice, there were lots of people talking about this online, but I don't think anybody really focused on there's two words here, top-down ideological bias, right? And so I think the concern of the administration is not the sort of general algorithmic bias, right, that might come from having a specific data set. It is that they don't developers putting their thumb on the scale on ideological bias. And that's the sort of thing that I think is technically easier to clear up in many ways, because it often happens in the inference phase. It happens with direct instructions to the AI about how they should answer to certain things. Not that it can't happen in other ways too, but that's the easiest way. And we saw that with Grok. It was relatively easy to figure out why it was doing that in some ways, because it was kind of instructed to do some of that, right? And so I think that that's what they're going at here. And that, to me, big First Amendment guy, classical liberal, gives me a little less heartburn than it might be if it was talking about, from a practical point of view, if it was talking about like eliminating all bias, because that just is impossible.
I do think this is probably one of those points where we may see further information from an executive order in the coming days on this. And I would also point out that this does seem to be one of the issues that if I had to bet, and I'm a podcaster, so I have no money to bet, but if I could bet, I would say this cultural issue of thinking about what values are implicit to models is just going to become more and more of a concern, especially as we get AI adoption increased among, in particular, kids, right? If you have any indication that a kid's engaging with an AI companion that's saying, hey, let's do X or let's do Y, or we don't care about this, but we really care about that, then I think we'll see even more of a focus here. But that's enough innovation for today. We've done so much. Tim, you are my go-to for any idea about AI infrastructure. Your special compute zones paper is bookmarked on my Google Chrome, and nice. I'm just going back and comparing notes today, very briefly, of what you were proposing there and what we see in the plan. Well done, sir. You were clearly persuasive. So I want to start at a high level of just how important is this AI infrastructure question to achieving AI dominance? And where do we stand today with respect to where we need to be and what our infrastructure looks like right now?
Yeah, so if people know anything about AI sort of recently, that it consumes a lot of energy. And I think there's a lot of caveats to this, like on an individual basis, your usage of something like ChatGPT is a very small fraction of your own energy consumption, but sort of writ large for the industry, sort of developing and deploying these models at scale requires a lot of concentrated power that is going to chips and data centers. And yeah, building these things is rapidly becoming this industrial scale undertaking, one in which like the US has historically led the world, but we're sort of now running up against the sort of classical barriers that we normally hit when trying to do large-scale infrastructure projects, which is environmental permitting. And we've talked a lot about the specific issues here and everything that goes wrong. But yeah, in general, sort of infrastructure projects in this country are held up for years, largely because of the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. And yeah, unfortunately, it's the case that sort of like a lot of the large-scale projects that are prevented from being connected to the grid are clean energy. So sort of those environmental groups who are typically suing these projects and causing them to sort of get held up endlessly in permitting delays are often undermining their own supposed goals in terms of protecting the environment. And we see this play out in AI. And so with AI in particular, sort of thinking of the requirements over the next few years, Anthropic just recently put out this great report saying that they think they need 5 gigawatts of power to train their most advanced models in about 2 years. I think it was 2028 was the year that they gave, which, to put that in perspective, a single gigawatt is about like one large nuclear reactor. And so that's 5 large nuclear reactors to train a single model. So, running continuously for presumably a few months, which is kind of the average time that you train these models.
And just to check my facts, we don't see those coming on board in the next 2 years.
Yeah, so there's sort of been this effort over the last, I'd say, 2 years to kind of snap up all the excess energy capacity, including at nuclear power plants across the country. And we're now seeing sort of companies push up against that limit of that approach and also start to look overseas to get access to large-scale energy resources. So, the deals in the UAE in the Gulf are sort of like the biggest example of this that we've seen, with OpenAI and others sort of going over there and wanting to build, their Stargate UAE over there and get access to both energy, but also, the large amounts of money that these companies have in terms of sovereign wealth funds. And so, yeah, I think there's basically, to boil it down, solving this environmental permitting issue and sort of like the delays that imposes on these kinds of projects, both data centers themselves as well as power plants and transmission lines, is really important if you want to maintain leadership in AI. And yeah,
just
I think
to pause there for 1 second, because I want to hear your takes on a lot of these specific provisions. But Janet, can you tee up the national security ramifications of building this infrastructure here, as opposed to just saying anytime we need more power production or another data center, we're always going to look overseas? Or how do you think through that calculus?
I mean, we're looking at the most transformative technology potentially in human history. And a willingness to cede leadership to an overseas country I don't think is in the US national interest. And even to put it more in perspective, I saw in Anthropic's report that, and some other places too, that China brought online 400 gigawatts of energy last year. And so, there's multiple factors that enter into like your competitiveness in AI. You've got compute, US leading, but then you've got energy to power that compute. You've got data. I mean, we've got copyright and other privacy laws here. Other countries don't necessarily. And then you've got talent. And there's across this spectrum, I feel that energy is really posing a risk to US leadership in this space. And sure, you can partner with overseas countries, but you want to be very careful about what capabilities and to what extent you're transferring the most powerful capabilities offshore. I think it's a very different situation if you're looking at your closest partners in top secret facilities or like with American protection and ownership. But if you're looking at a country that has ties to China, I think it's a very different story.
Mm-hmm. Neil, did you want to jump in here?
No.
You're good. You're good.
Great.
No jumping. Stay seated, please. Jessica, I think looking again at these provisions, what stands out to me is that holistic picture yet again, where we're not just saying how do we improve the policy, but thinking through some of those second order effects. Here are the cybersecurity concerns. What stood out to you in this?
I thought this was really good stuff. The cybersecurity provisions and also the stuff about sort of maturing the federal capacity to do incident response. I mean, we actually, I think, do need to kind of update our homeland security approach for an era of 21st century geopolitical competition that is technology enabled. And I think, obviously, again, like really matters where the rubber hits the road, but this sort of tees up and elevates the need for that. And so, my hope is that it can be followed through on.
Yeah, and it's wild to think that cybersecurity really has to be something that is baked in throughout the entire AI stack, and I'm not sure that's always been appreciated, and it rings through this report, which is impressive. So, Tim, for you, given that you are well-versed in all of these issues, are any of these provisions something you just circled with a big red pen of most excited about or that you think is most transformative that you'll be paying attention to?
Yeah, I'd say, ultimately, in sort of the environmental permitting space, congressional action is the thing that actually moves the needle. We've talked a lot about this at the Institute for Progress in terms of, the specific things we want to see in a NEPA reform bill. But I think the federal government has a range of authorities to speed up these kinds of projects in specific circumstances. And so I'd say my take on this so far, and obviously a lot of the devil is in the details, a lot of these things, is these are all pretty modest, but together a potentially sort of, moderate effect on our ability to sort of build data centers and associated energy infrastructure faster. A couple of things I'll call out, it's the categorical exclusions thing is very useful.
Can you flesh that out in more
detail?
detail?
Basically a categorical exclusion is where an agency basically determines that a particular type of project doesn't need to go through the environmental review process because it's sort of excluded. And so this, obviously you can't do this to an entire big nuclear reactor, but you can do it for a lot of the activities that sort of add calendar time to the project. So site characterization, going and taking soil samples, doing preliminary design, installing transformers and switchgear sort of at the site before you sort of go ahead and do the big build. These are all potentially activities that you can categorically exclude. And if one agency determines that it can do this, the other agencies can all do this as well. And so, I think directing agencies to be very creative with figuring out which categorical exclusions they can find and use is great. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question
Yes.
on this? Because I think, I know you said that congressional action is what's needed to drive this forward. And people have different views as to how.
Is the most helpful thing.
Yes,
So,
okay.
yeah.
I wonder how much do you think can be achieved with purely executive action, particularly given the litigious nature of these environmental permitting ideas and build-outs. I just think that some of the biggest delays seem to be just really protracted legal cases, particularly across jurisdictions for transmission lines. How optimistic are you that in the next few years, which are critical for winning the AI race, that this is going to be enough?
Yeah, not optimistic overall. So like I said, kind of modest
very
to moderate
sad
effects.
business, Tim. Come on.
We need more.
Yeah,
And I think
okay.
what I'm optimistic about is that this at least plants a flag in the ground for this administration where, I think, Congress has been waiting to some extent on the administration, especially sort of Republicans, to figure out what they should be prioritizing in AI. And I think this sort of, puts a flag in the ground and says, we really care about AI and energy. Here's the things we're excited about. We think, NEPA is this huge burden. And hopefully we do see bills coming off the back of this. that tries to tackle the core underlying problems.
Well, now you're just sounding like Oliver Twist. Please, sir, may
Yeah.
I have some more? We'll see what happens,
It's
and
all
we'll
I've
see
got,
if my
Kevin.
accent improves. Yeah. So before we move on to a different section here, I do think this is one of there's a provision here that didn't maybe find a home in the right spot, or they weren't sure where to place it, which is the workforce for AI infrastructure. And we mentioned workforce earlier. Again, as I noted, workforce was the #1 principle that was flagged. Although I will say, if you look at the introductory statement by the president at the very start, there's just a short, maybe, it may be one long run-on sentence, but there is no mention of workers. There's reshape global balance of power, address our global competitors in this race, focus on national security imperative, global technology dominance. So I understand that we listed workers as the first principle. I'm not sure I saw that as thoroughly fleshed out, but did anyone have a different take on whether this focus on workers really did ring through and what to watch for in the coming months and years, I guess? Neil, any indications? I will say, I'll tip my hand and say that we have been hearing about reskilling and reskilling and upskilling since globalization, since probably time in memoriam. I mean, you can go to the 1955 report on automation, as one of us has. For the audience, I am putting my finger on my nose. And we see this language brought up again and again and again about, we'll just reskill or upskill folks, and they'll adjust, and we will carry on. I didn't see the level of detail, and it is hard in a Christmas tree of a report to say, I'm going to list out every single new program and innovation. Did you get the sense that this will be something that they're diving into and trying to improve upon past models of reskilling?
I don't know. I mean, there's so much left to be developed in this space. I will point out that when they talk about that first principle, the wording there is pretty careful, actually. It says, first, American workers are central to the Trump administration's AI policy. The administration will ensure that our nation's workers and their families gain from the opportunities created in this technological revolution. So it's not clear that that first principle is entirely about gaining from this technology in their jobs. It could be as American citizens or American residents generally, and that sort of family category adds that. I will say the thing that is relatively new here, a lot of people talk about reskilling and retraining because AI is taking your job. There's a whole section in this infrastructure section that's about making sure we have the workforce needed to build this infrastructure. That's different, right? Those are new jobs. That's not like reskilling people. That's like there's a huge number of plumbers, electricians, et cetera, that we need to be able to build these things. And so I think that focus is somewhat new to the conversation. It's something plenty of people have been calling for, but I think that emphasis here is really important.
Yeah, and it's going to be an incredible effort to see that whole scale development of, where do we get all these plumbers? Where do we get all these engineers? Who's going to raise their hand?
Right.
I'm not sure, but it will be an impressive kind of big scale initiative,
Yeah, and I think, I'm not sure if any of you Control-F the word immigration in this, but it does not appear. And I think, this is something, we came up across this in like the CHIPS Act, and I think it really wasn't solved as well, like where the government recognized that there's a massive shortage of workers to actually both build fabs, but also work in them as fab technicians. And this is a problem that, there's just not the workforce here in the States to do this. There was like reskilling and training programs that I think were not hugely successful, but also other countries are having these same problems as well. Like, Taiwan and South Korea also have huge shortages of workers here. And so, it's not surprising to me that sort of, for these kind of like construction-related jobs, that immigration potentially isn't the most helpful thing. But when we think about winning the AI race more broadly and sort of like the really sort of high-skilled talent that we actually need to bring in, we did sort of a data analysis where we looked at top AI startups that were founded over the last 2 years and found that more than half of them had at least one immigrant co-founder. And there's nothing in here around that. We had a bunch of recommendations in our action plan response, basically looking at sort of what are the targeted moves that the federal government could make to make high school immigration much more easy. Unfortunately, none of those are in there for, I think, understandable reasons. It's a very political hot topic at the moment. But
hot topic, and there were 10,000 comments, so maybe they just didn't get to that second page of yours. They just really focused on that infrastructure work.
Almost.
And before we get to our third bucket, because this one doesn't fit as squarely into our last topic here, another key omission we've talked about is IP. Right? We don't see the big data question taken head on. And Janet, do you think that was a strategic decision to leave that out? Even though right before recording, we did hear that President Trump mentioned that access to data was going to be a key consideration of his, and perhaps leaning into a sort of fair use exception. I'm doubting that actual formal language was used, but saying we need to make sure that this data question gets answered and that we don't get hung up by copyright. What do you think the data-sized hole in this, or the IP-sized hole in this plan signifies?
Yeah, it flirts around the data issue. It's got a little bit in terms of the scientific data sets.
Yes.
But it just does not touch copyright. And I think that's because it's such a contentious political issue. If you're looking at a national security angle, you've got other countries who have much greater access to data, or much fewer limitations on what data they can access and use, that I think will be of concern if copyright decisions come out a certain way. I think it's something that the administration might need to act on at some point, but I can imagine it's contentious.
And at a later day, and here again, I think the comparison of what adversaries are doing is fascinating, where in China we know there are national data exchanges, for example, that remedy a lot of this data shortage issue, or at least partially solve it. Obviously, AI labs would like as much data as possible.
Part of the challenge here is that there's, unlike some of these other areas, the levers that the executive branch can pull on copyright are relatively limited. I mean, they could have the Copyright Office do a report of some kind,
or fire the Copyright Office.
They could.
Maybe
they could have. So, but the levers are limited. So maybe that's another reason why they talk about it too much.
So, Jessica, I'm excited to go into our third pillar here. Lead in international AI diplomacy and security. What were your vibes from this section, and did any of these provisions and recommendations stand out in particular for you?
Yeah, I think it's a worthwhile ambition. It's not clear to me how that squares with recent changes at the State Department. I mean, I think some of the capacity to do this kind of work has been retained, but we also, my understanding is like the science and technology advisor to the secretary, kind of some of that infrastructure is gone. So I just think the administration is going to want to think through, ensuring that it retains the capacity to do the kind of work it's said it wants to do. On the, sort of competing and standard setting bodies, great. Let's just also be mindful that these should be scientific and technical bodies, and we would like to, I think this is a place where we have to thread the needle between understanding sort of geopolitics and engaging in our interests, and also like not making it a race to the bottom where this place where science and where like technical experts can really exchange free from politics kind of becomes this locus of geopolitical competition. I think that would make us all, we'd all be for the poor for it.
Do you think if you are sitting in the EU right now, what's your reaction to this section? Are you saying, well, at least it wasn't as angry as Vance's speech in Paris, so that's a step forward?
Yeah, I mean, all the stuff about like American values and the cultural references, I think, do not help to create the sense, right? There was language here, I don't have it at hand, but there was language here about engaging with like-minded partners, but it's not clear how like-minded we are at the moment, and I think some of the language and the rhetoric does not help to reinforce the perception that we're sort of on the same team. So it remains to be seen how that unfolds.
Yeah, Janet, how do you think this is being received abroad right now if you were to tap into your Spidey international diplomacy senses?
I think there's some allies and partners that are going to be welcoming this. I think particularly the first line on exporting American AI. And for me, that's one that's actually, that contains a lot. So, last administration had a really restrictive approach to AI exports and primarily focused on the frontier of AI and chips. But what we're seeing now is this shift to full stack technology diplomacy. So they're looking at not just the hardware, but also the software, the models, the applications. And I think that's a really exciting shift. Like Neil, you were saying that even if AI development stopped today, there'd be so much we could do with diffusing existing capabilities. I've heard the phrase, no one's bothering to learn how to ride the bike because the cars are coming. And I think when you engage with international partners, they aren't AGI-pilled like the US in most cases. And their questions are, well, where's the breakthrough health applications? Where's the public good applications? And there's a real demand in international countries for those things. So at the moment, I think we've actually risked seeding. There's been an underinvestment in public good applications in scientific breakthroughs, and that risks ceding space to China, where you don't need to have the frontier of capability to provide wraparound full stack technology offerings and support. So for me, this seems super strategic. You need government involvement because the labs are focused on the frontier, and there's economically rational to keep pushing that frontier forward. But at the same time, there's so much more that we could be doing to support the economic and growth ambitions of partners.
Well, and it seems too that this section can't be analyzed without looking at the open source language of the pivot to saying, hey, we want to make sure it's US AI that folks are using around the world, and you don't get that with closed models in the same way you can with an open source approach. But Neil, yes?
This is the section that, other than the deregulatory part in the innovation section, that stood out as the most direct contrast to the Biden administration approach. The diffusion rule was kind of an anti-diffusion rule, and it swept in many of our friends and allies in a way that I think surprised many of us. And this is this takes the exact opposite position, that basically those people should be getting the full AI stack rather than having to beg for chips from America. And so I think that really is a very big shift, and I think it's a positive one because the dynamic here is the rivalry with China. I think the Trump administration sees it that way, and that if we don't fill that gap for many of these countries, China will.
I think there's a yes and approach for the last diffusion rule as well, where I think there's still probably going to be quite strict controls on the chips. But by broadening your exports to more of the technology stack, that means if you think about compute, the chips, as the most defensible advantage that the US and its closest allies in the ecosystem have, is something you want to be really careful about ceding leadership over. Like if China's outcompeting us on energy, data, talent, potentially one day, this could be really key to US leadership. And I think it's unclear where they're going to fall on that spectrum as to how permissive with partners like UAE and Saudi Arabia. There's some deals happening, but there's strict controls on those. And I think as we look forward, there'll be work to codify in a new AI diffusion rule or otherwise more controls on the chips while nevertheless promoting export of other things.
Yeah, and I had actually flagged the recommended policy actions here as being pretty managed trade in many ways. I mean, the way they sort of recommend this is there's a lot of potential for micromanagement on the trade there in a way that maybe achieves some of those goals that you were talking about. So it's not laissez-faire here by any means. It doesn't seem like.
Yeah, and last but not least, in terms of specific provisions, the invest in biosecurity kind of tucked away at the very end. Jessica, I don't know if this stood out to you or if anyone had a hot take on this addition.
Good stuff. Not totally fleshed out. Not clear how it aligns with proposals. I'm not sure I want to say what I was about to say.
You're good.
Sorry,
you're good.
we're out. Yeah. I don't want to.
So just not totally fleshed out.
Yeah.
You can just carry on from there.
Okay. So
yeah.
Just good at a high level, not totally fleshed out. We'll see where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah. I do think it's telling that we're seeing a sort of convergence now between the folks who are accelerationists with respect to AGI and the folks who are maybe taking a safety bent of saying, hey, we may want AGI, and both may want some pursuit of the best technology, while very much acknowledging that these biosecurity threats in particular are worthy of concern. Tim, do you want to jump in here?
No, yeah, just agreed. And I think synthesis screening is a good approach here, where you have these centralized providers who are synthesizing sequences for you. Like you send orders to them, like a 3D printer for proteins and such. And yeah, at the moment, especially with AI biological design tools, it is the case that it's becoming easier to design super COVID if you wanted to, and so it kind of makes sense that we would want these centralized synthesis providers to check, is my customer a terrorist organization trying to synthesize super COVID, and if so, probably we shouldn't let them do that. I think it's a good thing to do.
I would double down on that take. All right,
I agree, but I think in this section there's one thing missing. It talks about engaging with international partners and allies. But if we look at the COVID example, that's a really clear demonstration of it doesn't have to be with a partner and ally that a risk emerges that can really devastate your national interests. And I'd like to see some engagement with China on these things, like risk managed, not sharing any sensitive IP or upskilling at all, but there's some good practices that should be shared across even with competitors.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think there's clear, shared international interest in preventing transnational crime, especially around terrorism and drug trafficking and other things. And in AI, these things could be exacerbated. Yeah, it makes total sense. Yeah.
One thing I thought was missing in this section was references to mitigation. So great that we're going to focus on evals. What happens when an eval shows that a model crossed a threshold? All these companies have signed, safety frameworks that say they'll pause deployment absent sufficient mitigations, but I don't think we have anywhere near, nothing approaching consensus on what constitutes a sufficient mitigation, who gets to decide what is sufficient, and I think this is sort of coming. We might not get there this year, but 18 to 24 months before one of these models can cause real world harm at scale. Maybe it's in bio, maybe it's advanced cyber, I don't know. But really, what is the national security policy community going to do when that happens? I mean, these companies are spending upwards of, $20 billion on a training run, and so how are we gonna sort of manage sort of promoting innovation and fulfilling those investments and also managing these kinds of risks?
And one maybe undercovered provision that I don't think will get a ton of attention but should is this focus on talent development specific to the Department of Defense, where if you go talk to folks in the armed services right now, they will tell you, hey, we don't know where we're going to get all this AI talent that we need, all this AI expertise. And there are provisions in here, for example, of encouraging the senior military colleges of having AI-specific training and bringing in instructors, and that sort of upskilling and educational efforts is so exciting to me, of saying we need to start thinking about the next generation, because to your point, Janet, earlier about talent, it's not just today's talent, but how are we thinking about the entire pipeline of folks who are going to have this level of expertise, who can begin to answer those mitigation questions and whatever comes down the road. Well, we've officially reached the vibe portion of this episode. So, Neil, earlier you were talking about how we've seen a pivot, arguably, from pervasive sense of AI safety being the dominant narrative on the Hill to perhaps now a complete or more thorough embrace of, we may not agree on all the details, as we just saw from the AI moratorium debate, but we do need to lean into AI dominance as a national priority. How secure do you feel about that narrative sticking on? Is it here to stay, or should we be looking for another pendulum swing?
Well, I think the rivalry with China anchors it somewhat, right? And so as that narrative took over, I think the idea that we were going to we'd be careful on our side, and that would be enough to get there. I think that argument gets weaker, or at least it has less narrative juice. So I think this sticks around for a while, as long as China's in the race, and I think they're in the race. One thing that I did find interesting and that anchors to this pretty well is the Center for AI Standards and Innovation, the renamed AI Safety Institute, is clearly sticking around. It's referred to many, many times in here, right? And so I think they're going to have a lot of work to do, because they're collaborators on so much of the stuff that's in here. So that is new. I think that's interesting, and we'll see how that, how the staffing of that affects the interplay between safety and
this is super interesting, because currently that team is, I think, around 20 people with a shoestring budget, not officially authorized. There's, maybe an appropriations bill for them coming. But yeah, the amount of things that they have in here, as well as just, what Commerce Secretary Lutnick asked them to do in sort of his recent announcement, is like way beyond like what they currently have the budget to be able to do. So yeah, it would be good to see specific appropriations.
I guess they're going to be the first of those government employees who need to make sure that they have access to AI tools.
Yes.
Well, just to double down on that, I don't think there's anything more important than ensuring that public sector has an awareness and a situational understanding of AI capabilities and as they're emerging. And I think there's a lot of people out there who want to make sure that AI goes well. So I feel like they might soon be hiring, and I'd just encourage people to go work for the government.
You've heard it here. Scaling Laws is now Craigslist of podcasts. We will be listing off job opportunities starting next episode. I do think, to your point, Neil, as I brought up earlier, if you're in the Department of Commerce tonight, if you are at Casey tonight, if you are at BIS tonight, you're thinking, when's my pay raise come based off of all of the initiatives that are coming down the pike? And I wonder if this is another area where, Tim, Congress too is saying, okay, well, how are we going to respond to this in terms of budget allocations, in terms of prioritizing what happens next session? We know the House is closed its doors through September, so we have a little bit of time to think through what they're going to focus on. But
well, to be fair, I mean, this is quite a bit smaller than the massive executive order from the Biden administration. I think it has far fewer directives.
That is true. That is true.
Maybe they have some resources left over from that.
Yes, they can go back to that playbook. And I'm wondering, too, how you all think this might shape the discourse at the state level. So following the AI moratorium conclusion to what I think everyone can say was I'm going to just bleep show and not complete my own sentence there. Is this going to be something where folks are now going to their governors or going to their state legislators and saying, hey, we've got some guidance now about what the executive really wants to see. Let's make sure we're aligning here. Tim, I'm eager to hear from you on this in particular, because states have such a key role in a lot of these permitting issues and a lot of these decisions around energy allocation and how land may be used. Obviously, we're talking mostly here about federal land, but how do you see states maybe buying into this or acting as bulwarks to it?
Yeah, so I think, permitting is a key area where productive state regulation is really possible for the goals outlined here. I think realistically, we're not going to see a massive slowdown in proposed state AI bills as a result of this. I think, Neil, you often draw attention to this. I think, last year there was around 600 AI-related state AI bills introduced. I think so far this year, we're coming up on double that already, sort of halfway through the year. And so the velocity of state AI-related bills is coming really thick and fast. And I think, in my perspective, the median state AI bill is likely pretty bad, but some of them actually can be, pretty productive and do useful things. And I think one of the main things that's really difficult at the state level is, the median office, the median state legislator has 3 or 4 staff, and they're getting paid $30,000 a year. They do not have the capacity to hire the kind of team and do the kind of research that's required to grapple with big questions around AI, what capabilities are we going to see in 2 years? What jobs are going to be automated? Are we going to see recursive self-improvement? When's ASI going to come? These aren't the kind of things that you can resolve at that kind of level. But there are a lot of things that sort of do make sense to adjudicate at the state level, including the effects that state and local permitting laws have on AI development. I'm especially interested in your take, Neil, on the sort of moratorium-esque provisions here. This FCCC one is extremely interesting, but I don't know what the effect would be. I
don't fully understand the FCC one either. The one that drew my attention because of my background having been at the FTC was the FTC one, which I thought was a sort of repudiation of the previous FTC in a way that I don't think has been very vocal.
Right, and
that was interesting.
I would love to get your perspective on what this FTC provision basically says, hey, we're going to re-examine a lot of the agreements we've reached with companies and see maybe we don't want to adhere to that agreement anymore. What's on the table with respect to what could actually happen at the FTC? Chair Ferguson tonight, what's he thinking?
So first of all, it says we're going to look at the active cases that were started under the previous administration to see if, and interestingly, it's not just if the case itself would harm innovation, but if the theories of liability that are advanced might harm future innovation, right? It doesn't have to be about that. That's interesting. And then, yeah, so all of the major tech companies, I mean, I don't know what we're counting as major anymore because there's more of them now, but all of the major tech companies are under a consent order with the FTC on something. And so there's lots of existing agreements that could be reviewed to see whether or not this makes sense if we want these guys to build the AI that's going to defeat China. So I don't know exactly what's on the table. This is not an FTC that's particularly like super friendly with those tech companies. So there's a bit of like trying to figure out exactly what this provision is saying, and I'm not really sure.
So to wrap things up, put a little bow on our Christmas present, I want to know what everyone is either going to be keeping their closest eye on or what they think is most in need of further examination. So I'm going to go ahead and start because I want to be a fair professor to all of you. I think for me, with the school year coming up, I am really, really interested in the execution, and this is pulling from a different executive order, but it gets brought up in the AI action plan. The execution of making sure schools have the resources they need to get their teachers, to get their administrators up to speed on AI, because the number of state superintendents, for example, who haven't even outlined an AI policy is just ludicrous. The fact that we don't know how we're using AI in schools or what's permissible and what's not is just bonkers to me, and we can't expect the next generation of students to just vibe on AI and suddenly become the AI-ready workforce that is called for here. So that's something that I'm going to be studying closely, and I hope the folks at the White House are leaning into heavily. Neil?
Well, because I spend so much time looking at state legislation, I'm going to really be keeping an eye on how these provisions get operationalized about the interaction between the federal government and the state government. There's lots of appetite in Congress still to do something to assert, a congressional role here. Obviously, the administration thinks that there's a strong federal role in this policy space, and that's kind of counter some of the, at least some of the proposed effects from some of the, especially blue states, on how they want to do AI regulation. And the second one, I'm going to look to see like this AI woke stuff. The term isn't really in here.
Where is it?
There's a little bit of bias.
Right.
But there's an executive order. I'm really curious about that. I think there are constitutional ways and that they can achieve some of those goals, but there are some very unconstitutional ways they can pursue those goals as well. And it really will be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, and I think this might be more like Hanukkah than Christmas, because I think we're going to get multiple days of gifts that we're going to have to grapple with.
Yeah.
Yes, Jan.
Two stand out to me. The first is the interoperability, robustness and control work. I think these are the tricky issues that until you get right, you can't actually adopt these things in real critical systems and functionings. We still don't really understand why AI systems go weird sometimes. And until we get that right, it really inhibits our ability to use that for defense and national security and critical infrastructure outcomes. And the second I'm really interested in, and we're doing some work at CNS at the moment, gentle plug, that is getting that right balance between the protect and promote when it comes to US AI offerings. So compute, probably want to be more not restrictive, but careful about the amount and to whom large quantities go, given that is what underpins America's AI edge at the moment and is very defensible. But on the other side, how do you promote other aspects of the tech stack broadly to make sure that it's US AI that the world runs on?
And Janet, sorry, before I let you go, I can't let you off that easy when you tee up a great ball like that. Were you surprised by the relative lack of analysis of US military integration of AI here, or do you think that's something we'll see forthcoming? I mean, we had some mention of we want to encourage DoD adoption of AI, but we didn't get a play-by-play analysis of what are geopolitical ambitions with respect to integrating AI into the armed forces, in my opinion. But if you had a different read, I want to hear it.
I think there's still more to be done in that space. I'm interested in what happens to like the National Security Memorandum 25 that came out under Biden, had a whole range of efforts for agencies to to take part in and understand and stress test AI capabilities to the very edge with classified data. I'm interested to see what happens in this space, but I think some of the things that don't talk about the military side, like the interpretability, robustness, and control, I keep coming back to, because that's what needs to underpin it.
I like Tynanite SPO on our Christmas gift. All right, Tim.
Yeah, two things I'll be very interested to see how they're implemented and excited to see if they go well. One is there's just all these measures throughout the action plan that gesture at sort of setting up a infrastructure and processes for measurement and evaluation. So, at the moment, it's just really hard to predict what's coming, and the government is sort of even further behind everyone else at the moment. It just doesn't have the sort of team and people and processes and sort of like the science that it needs to be able to sort of do proactive policy making, figure out, where do our capabilities sit right now? Where will they sit in 6 months? How does this apply to China? What is the so what in terms of what we should do from a policy perspective, both around export controls, but also basic R&D and security and things like this. And so, yeah, there's a lot of things in here that try to resolve this, but, I think we've been trying to do this for a while, and it's extremely hard, especially with sort of the level of resourcing available to places like Casey. So excited to see how that plays out. And another thing I'm just glad to see, and I hope it plays out well, is the sort of focus on full stack security, so for data center software models, et cetera. I think this action plan really acknowledges that, AI models are becoming a important source of new critical infrastructure that, are going to increasingly drive economic growth, but also scientific discovery. And there's a bunch of types of attacks that an adversary could carry out on that, from, denying the operation of data centers through sort of sabotaging power, through to sort of data poisoning attacks on models, making them love owls, if you saw that recent paper on this. You can do very nefarious things. Then there's very sort of AI-specific threat models that we need to figure out how to address. And so, yeah, excited to see R&D, but also sort of like processes and standards around that kind of thing. Yeah.
Okay, close us out, Jessica. No pressure.
Yeah, no pressure. I guess three things for me. One is just given the levels of uncertainty around vulnerabilities, threats, capabilities, like the information sharing piece is so important, and I don't think that's fully fleshed out. We've got this sort of intra-firm information sharing agreement, useful and valuable, but like what is it that government expects from firms, and what should be voluntary and what's mandatory? We need like way more structured thinking about that, and I think this kind of moves us in the right direction on a couple pieces, but the puzzle is like much bigger. The other is on this protect front, great that we're making all of these investments and tightening export controls, but all of that is kind of useless if China can come in at the end and just scoop up our trained models. So we really actually do need to put meat on the bones there, and there's a lot that we can do. So I think this was a good baseline, but I'd like to see where that goes. And then the last is this mitigations piece. The evaluation stuff is great, and we need to take it to the next step.
Yeah. Well, huge thanks to Neil, Janet, Tim, and Jessica for joining this episode of Scaling Laws. Listeners, don't worry. Our next AI Book Club book will be 50 Shades of Grey. So get ready for that. It should be a slightly different conversation.